Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Aaron Bastani, and tonight I have the pleasure of being joined by Dan Evans as a co-host all the way from South Wales. Dan,
Hey,
how
mate,
are
you
we?
doing? I'm good, mate. Thanks for having me.
I'm good. You look like you've gone for the Shoreditch bar general manager vibe.
Oh, thank you. Well, I thought it was like academic, like respected sociologist. But mate, no, the bar managers, I'll take that as well.
Hey, why not be both, right? There's very few people that can pull off both of those. Shoreditch, general bar manager and very successful sociologist. Had a great interview with Dan Evans about his book over on YouTube, obviously on this channel, Novara Media. Fantastic conversation. I think one of the best conversations we've heard over the last 2 years. Go check that out if you haven't already. And Dan, before we go any further, for people who aren't already familiar with your work, who are you? What do you do? And what's the title of that esteemed book I just referred to?
Oh, thanks, mate. So the book is A Nation of Shopkeepers, The Unstoppable Rise of the Petty Bourgeoisie, which is basically about the rise of the British lower middle classes and their role in, I guess, right-wing populism.
Very relevant. Only getting more relevant, by the way.
I was going to say, the worse the UK, the worse politics gets, the more relevant my book gets. So it's hard to know if it's good or bad.
We will be talking about this in the context of welfare stuff in a bit. Coming up on tonight's show, we'll hear from Daniel Levy on Israel's resumed bombing of Gaza. Liz Kendall has confirmed which benefits are set to be slashed and which will be subject to more consultations, and why the US is trying to build space defenses in rural Pembrokeshire. A first story and a warning that this contains graphic images. Israel shattered the Gaza ceasefire by launching a brutal wave of airstrikes on the enclave in the early hours of this morning. At least 404 people have been killed in airstrikes by the IDF, including women, small children, and the elderly. And more than 560 people have also been wounded, with many more believed to still remain buried under rubble. Airstrikes hit North Gaza, Gaza City, Deir al-Balah, Khan Yunis, al-Mawasi, and Rafah overnight. And forced displacement orders were broadcast by Israel on X for 4 neighborhoods. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has confirmed that Washington was consulted before those attacks took place.
The Trump administration and the White House were consulted by the Israelis on their attacks in Gaza tonight. And as President Trump has made it clear, Hamas, the Houthis, Iran, all those who seek to terrorize not just Israel, but also the United States of America, will see a price to pay. All hell will break loose.
Hell is certainly one way to describe the scenes from across Gaza today. Here is Dr. Farouz Sidwa speaking from Nasser Hospital.
So just utter carnage and destruction overnight. I was here in Gaza a year ago during the peak of the fighting in Khan Yunis, and the mass casualties back then looked exactly like the mass casualty that I saw today. Mostly children, the other half are mostly women, and occasionally there's a man, but I'm pretty sure the man has nothing to do with any of this that's going on. I did 6 operations overnight. Half of them were in small children, so probably 6 and below. I wasn't exactly sure their ages, but it's probably about 6 and below. Most of them are going to go on to die, unfortunately.
Israel has confirmed that the fragile 2-month-old ceasefire is now over, with the Prime Minister's office releasing this statement.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz have instructed the Israeli forces to take strong action against the Hamas terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip. It follows Hamas's repeated refusal to release our hostages, as well as its rejection of all the proposals it has received from U.S. Presidential Envoy Steve Witkoff and from the mediators. It says the army is attacking targets of the Hamas terrorist organization throughout the Strip in order to achieve the objectives of the war. They have been determined by the political echelon, including the release of all our hostages, the living and the deceased. The statement ends by saying Israel will act against Hamas with increasing military strength.
And this is not the first time that Israel has violated the ceasefire agreement, which came into effect on the 19th of January. Between the 19th of January and the 17th of March, the IDF killed at least 170 people in the Strip. That means an average of 3 casualties a day. On the 2nd of March, Israel cut off all aid supplies to the devastated enclave. And a week later, Israel cut off all electricity, leaving Palestinians without functioning desalination plants, vital for clean drinking water. Now, with the full resumption of Israel's genocidal war against the people of Gaza, former National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir's far-right Otzma Yehudit party is returning to government. The faction quit Netanyahu's government after the ceasefire deal was agreed in January. Itamar Ben-Gvir said this in a public statement. We welcome the return of the State of Israel, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to intense fighting. As we said in recent months, when we withdrew from the government, Israel must return to fighting in Gaza. This is the right, moral, ethical, and most justified step in order to destroy the Hamas terrorist organization and bring back our hostages. We must not accept the existence of the Hamas organization, and it must be destroyed. But what does this resumption of intense Israeli attacks mean? And will it be sustained from here on in? Earlier today, I spoke to former Israeli peace negotiator Daniel Levy. I began by asking him why Israel has attacked with this level of ferocity.
The shortest answer is because they can. So we know that Netanyahu did not want a ceasefire. The terms of the ceasefire didn't change for the better part of a year. The reason we got a ceasefire in the first place, it seems that Netanyahu didn't want to risk getting off on the wrong track with the Trump administration, with Trump. They seem to be serious about a ceasefire. He took a political hit when that ceasefire happened on, I think it was Jan 19th, with his coalition not totally unraveling, but being weakened. Since then, Netanyahu has been worried that he gets politically weakened the further he moves into the permanence of a ceasefire. His comfort zone in terms of his political and coalition management, and it aligns with the ideology, is to be the wartime leader. For that, you need perpetual war. Of course, Israel's still occupying part of Lebanon. Of course, Israel's gone deeper into Syria. It's been conducting the most aggressive, far-reaching military actions and displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank since 1967. But Gaza is also a key part of this. So I think the short answer is, once he saw that he had wiggle room with the Trump administration, he went for this. As for the intensity, look, Israel and Netanyahu individually has an arrest warrant against his name for precisely the kind of crimes that he already reinstituted on March 2nd with the blocking of supplies, using starvation as a weapon of war. That's the International Criminal Court arrest warrant. He has the case of the urgent provisional measures at the International Court of Justice, so we shouldn't be surprised by the intensity either. I draw one distinction, which is this was all aerial. The question next, at some stage down the line, will be, is there a mass call-up of reservists to do a major ground operation? And I say that because that's where there will be some problems domestically. We see that only 50% of reservists have been showing up recently.
And what's the sort of sentiments of the Israeli public, the Israeli electorate? Because, as you've said, these were aerial attacks. Is there support for another ground engagement in Gaza when it comes to the Israeli public, but specifically the kinds of people that Netanyahu wants to get to either vote for him or his coalition allies?
There is genuine polarization there, not primarily other than a relatively small cohort who have stood up for anything approaching the humanity and rights of Palestinians. That's not the fault line. The fault line is, what's the priority? Is it to get the Israelis still being held out of Gaza? One saw during the first phase of the ceasefire that those who came out alive, out of hospital, being able to get on with their lives. Is the priority, therefore, getting the rest of the Israelis out? Do people want a return to some kind of normalcy? The economy getting started again, have the Passover holiday, which is coming up, in some kind of relative quiet. And this is, again, something I really worth drawing people's attention to, do people who are active reservists want to be called up and go in there again, knowing that they are potentially endangering the lives of those Israelis still being held? Again, I draw a distinction between that and caring about the Palestinians. That has been kicked even deeper into the long grass. But for Netanyahu's base, this is a happy day. This is what they want to see. Look, it was good, as far as they were concerned, that we were back to committing the war crime of collective punishment and withholding humanitarian aid as Israel. It was good, as far as they were concerned, that there was this massive operation, 40,000 plus displaced from 3 refugee camps in the West Bank. But it's still much more satisfying to be back seeing those scenes. And I'm saying this, slightly ironic, but this is just the way things are. The more permissive environment, even more, created by the Trump administration to carry out these crimes. Netanyahu's political coalition is stronger today. The Ben Gvir Jewish power faction has said they will rejoin the government. So he is stronger politically today than he was just 24 hours ago. But for some Israelis, a fundamental social contract has been broken, and the families of those being held, and some who came out already, some of those who come out alive, because that's the way they get out alive, is in these exchanges as a result of these negotiations. They are back on the street and they are laying the dead cat at the door of Netanyahu because they know that he is responsible for this. He has sabotaged the negotiations. That's what they're saying, that he has refused to go along with the framework of a ceasefire, which he agreed.
And how is Israeli civil society receiving the families of hostages who've either been freed or who are still in the Gaza Strip? I mean, they're saying inconvenient truths for the government and its allies. Are they being villainized in some quarters? And how is that even possible?
It's divided, Aaron. But what you have had, which you were speaking to there, is a very effective campaign. One that I think many people, and I might include myself among them, would have thought perhaps inconceivable when this started, that you would get to a place amongst that base, that Netanyahu base. And I'm not talking here about 10%, okay? This is the 50% plus of Jewish Israelis, of the Zionist camp that has kept Netanyahu in power all these years. That's not quite where he's polling today, but it's not far off, and we're not in an election anyway. That you get to a point where the Netanyahu constituency, the zealots, the dehumanization of Palestinians and so much broader a cross-section of Israelis, the fact that they are not shown and apparently don't care what has happened to Palestinians, means that you have this environment where much of the media is devoted to saying the families are the enemies of finishing the job of defeating Hamas. Israel has not defeated Hamas. In the last week before the ceasefire, in their at least third, perhaps more, major incursion into Beit Hanun, Israel took significant losses amongst IDF troops. So Hamas is not defeated. More broadly, the will, the resilience of the Palestinian people has not been crushed. But inside Israel, there is a significant cohort in the media, in politics, and therefore that's reflecting something in society that believe that it's endgame time. This is zero sum. And if the hostages are the cost, and if one has to have unpleasant encounters with those families, then that is the price. And what you've seen is the families being arrested at protests. You've seen shouting matches between serving politicians and the families. And the question is, will the mobilization in support of the Israelis being held be sufficient for Netanyahu to say, whoops, maybe I can't go there, maybe I can't call up the reservists? Netanyahu's bet that he is placing is that enough will show up and that his supportive media machine, and of course the complicity of the West on the outside, will be enough to get to that place where he can continue this. I wish I could tell you that it's a foolish bet. Unfortunately, it's a bet that is likely to work out for him.
That was Daniel Levy, former Israel peace negotiator. Staying with Israel-Palestine, extreme ultra-Zionist group Betar have threatened UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese during her visit to London this week. Betar, which has been labelled an extremist group by the Anti-Defamation League, posted this on X. Join us to give Francesca Albanese a welcome in London. Tuesday, Betar will build lists there as well of people who must be deported from the UK. Quite extraordinary that an organisation based in the USA, which is effectively trying to advance the perceived interests of Israel, thinks it has anything to offer with regards to deporting people from this country. F off, frankly, is the kindest way I can put it. The pager emojis are believed to be a reference to the pager attacks on Lebanon in September last year, which killed 37 people, including small children. The pager attacks were widely attributed to Israel at the time and condemned as a war crime under international law. Francesca Albanese is in London for a speaking engagement at UCL, the University College of London, and Betar's threat on social media comes after the group claimed credit for the arrest of Palestinian activist and Columbia University graduate Mahmoud Khalil. A counter-demonstration from UCL Action for Palestine is reportedly underway outside the talk. If you want to know more about the history of this conflict, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people for more than a century now, in fact, I would suggest coming to an event I think is on April the 7th. That's at Earth in Hackney. We can put the link in the description below, perhaps, of this conversation. I will be speaking live to Ilan Pappé, one of the outstanding historians of that conflict, not just the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but also the growth of the last 150 years of the Israel lobby in both the UK and the US. Extraordinary man, brilliant historian. If you want to know more, come along. We can chat afterwards as well, maybe. And of course, Ilan will be available to talk to you, hopefully sign some of his books. Knowledge is power when it comes to this stuff. It really is. Bring a friend as well. I always say, if you're ever at a loss for Christmas presents for people, buy them something that's, somewhat radical and informative. I think his book on An Introduction to the Palestine Conflict by Ilan Pappé is a really great place to start. Like I say, in any case, if you want to come along on April the 7th, the link is in the description below. I couldn't believe that when I woke up this morning, by the way. At the time, the fatalities number was a bit lower, but it was in the hundreds. I couldn't believe what I was reading. You just go from, it wasn't 0 to 60 because, of course, 3 people have been killed on average every day of the quote-unquote ceasefire, but just all in. And I thought Daniel's input there, quite extraordinary, that to save the hostages, the Israeli right is now effectively declaring a form of war against the hostages and their families. Let's see what you've got to say. We've also got some breaking news right now. Vladimir Putin has agreed to halt strikes on Ukrainian energy targets for 30 days after a phone call with Donald Trump. In other words, not much. Not much. Of course, the Russian position overnight was that there would be no ceasefire as long as arms and weapons shipments continued to flow into Ukraine. De facto, they want, therefore, the ability to rearm while ensuring that Ukraine doesn't have that possibility. But that is some breaking news. Vladimir Putin has agreed to halt strikes on Ukrainian energy targets for 30 days after a phone call with Donald Trump. You know what? If you want to keep the lights on, if you want some central heating in Kyiv or Lviv, that's something, right? It's not nothing, but it's not as big as what was being asked originally. The Labour government has finally announced its plans to slash benefits after weeks of anxiety for claimants, with potential cuts being trailed in the media. A Work and Pensions Secretary, Liz Kendall, unveiled plans to cut £5 billion from the welfare budget by 2030 in the Commons today.
Mr. Speaker, this government is ambitious for our people and our country, and we believe that unleashing the talents of the British people is the key to our future success. But the social security system we inherited from the Conservatives is failing the very people it is supposed to help and holding our country back. Places that were decimated in the 80s and 90s, written off for years by successive Tory governments and never given the chances they deserve. And the consequences of this failure are there for all to see. Millions of people who could work, trapped on benefits, denied the income, hope, dignity and self-respect that we know good work brings. And taxpayers paying millions more on the costs of failure, with spending on working age sickness and disability benefits up 20 billion since the pandemic, set to rise by a further 18 billion by the end of this Parliament to £70 billion a year. And it is not like this in most other comparable countries, where spending on these benefits since the pandemic is either stable or falling, whilst ours continues to inexorably rise.
Where'd you start? Where'd you start? Communities decimated during the 1980s and 90s. Well, guess what, Liz? Labour was in power for 13 years after 1997. They could have done something to help those people then, just a thought. You know, we've not had non-stop Conservative government in this country for 45 years. Thank God. But we haven't. And that point about spend falling elsewhere, going up here, the UK welfare safety net, things like job seekers allowance, pensions, are actually very low when you compare them to continental Europe on average. Certainly compared to Northern Europe, much lower compared to Germany, the Netherlands, the Nordic countries. And there's a detail as well I do want to add before I go on here. Liz Kendall lives in a £4 million property in London with her financier partner. £4 million. And her heating bill is paid for by the taxpayer. Her heating bill. And she's talking about a culture of dependence. You're signing off on your own tweets. You're describing your lifestyle. Extraordinary. Time after time we're seeing this. You know, I was thinking the same with Rachel Reeves recently. Rachel Reeves, between her and her husband and his rental property, they earn approximately £400,000 a year gross. Now, I appreciate they'll pay significant amounts of tax, but £400,000 a year gross. Do these people really have the slightest idea how hard it is for people on PIP? Or let alone people on PIP, actually, just people on median income who can't get on the property ladder or whose kids are struggling with £50,000 worth of student debt. If you're in a £4 million property and your heating bills are being paid, I would suggest you haven't got the slightest clue what life is like for an ordinary person in this country. The government will make it tougher to access personal independence payments, also known as PIP, which people with disabilities and health conditions can receive to help with the cost of their conditions.
We will legislate for a change in PIP so people will need to score a minimum of 4 points in at least one activity to qualify for the daily living element of PIP from November 2026. This will not affect the mobility component of PIP and only relates to the daily living element.
This will affect anyone who needs to claim PIP for conditions that don't involve a mobility issue, a measure that includes all mental health related conditions.
Every day, there are more than 1,000 new PIP awards. That's the equivalent of adding a population the size of Leicester every single year. Mr. Speaker, that is not sustainable long term.
It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. Maybe she wrote this speech in her £4 million property where the heating is paid for by the taxpayer. Who knows? That's sustainable, by the way. That's really sustainable. Not just sustainable. We should have more of it. Actually, she should be paid more, presumably. MPs don't earn enough. You heard that canard recently. But this is not sustainable, okay? People who can scrape enough money together to have lunch at a Costa Coffee once or twice a week, that's not sustainable, guys. Sorry, you need to have the instant coffee at home instead. There are more shake-ups planned for those on universal credit. The work capability assessment for universal credit will be scrapped in 2028. A Labour will funnel these people through a tougher PIP assessment instead. Incapacity benefits under universal credit will be frozen for existing claimants from April 2026, and new claimants will see their incapacity benefit reduced. The government says that those who have the most severe and lifelong health conditions and will never be able to work will see their incomes protected through an additional premium and won't be reassessed in future. Kendall claims the government wants to, quote, rebalance universal credit payments so there is no incentive for people to define themselves as incapable of work.
We will bring in a permanent, above-inflation rise to the standard allowance in universal credit for the first time ever. Yeah. A £775 annual increase in cash terms by 2029-30 and a decisive step to tackle the perverse incentives in the system. We will also fix the failing system of reassessments. The Conservatives failed to switch reassessments back on after the pandemic. So they're down by more than 2/3, with face-to-face assessments going from 7 in 10 to only 1 in 10. We will turn these reassessments back on at scale.
In an effort to get more people into what Kendall calls good work, she announced the government will be investing £1 billion in employment support. The Work and Pension Secretary also ruled out the rumoured freeze to PIP payments earlier today, a move that not even George Osborne was willing to countenance at the height of austerity. And she said that the government will consult on a raft of other changes, including job seekers allowance, unemployment and support allowance, as well as stopping anyone under the age of 22 from claiming the incapacity top-up to universal credit. Dan, what do you make of these changes and what do you think they mean for Labour electorally? And then on top of that, I want to ask you about the perceptions of Labour, people like Liz Kendall, where you live in South Wales.
I might address the second one first, if that's okay, Aaron. It's a very difficult watch there. I was just getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And just the thought of people like Liz Kendall, the Labour front benches, or indeed the Labour back benches, as you rightly say, people who have never really done a hard day's work in their life. They've gone from Oxbridge to special advisors to being parachuted into a safe seat, having the nerve, the temerity to attack some of the most vulnerable people in society and make it harder for them to live, just makes me so almost violently angry. It really is beneath contempt, and it's just, in terms of like the broad history of the Labour movement, that they've just brought so much shame on it. It's actually incredible. And then every day you think they've reached a new low, and they manage to surpass it. And as you rightly say, let's just talk the welfare state used to have two pillars. It was state intervention in the economy to create a productive economy, and then using that wealth to fund redistribution. And obviously we've abandoned the former. They can't. I'll give you an example. They've just, despite the pre-election promises, no job losses to the green transition, they've just stood by as Tata have just pulled out and caused 2,000 jobs in Port Talbot, which is right near where I live. They've sat by while Vauxhall have basically laid off all those workers in Luton. They're now going to stand by while all those workers get laid off in Grangemouth. And it's just incredible. On the one hand, that they're attacking the benefit system, while on the other hand, facilitating this political economic paradigm, which is throwing people onto the scrap heap. It's just, it really, I just find it absolutely incredible. And as for perceptions of Labour, well, they couldn't be lower. I mean, funny enough, I just had a conversation with a lady on my street about fly tipping, drug dealing, antisocial behavioural, and the stuff that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And apropos of nothing, she just said, the Labour councillors, the Labour government are absolutely useless. And I'm very confident that Labour are headed for electoral wipeout in Wales in 2026 in the next Senate elections. But I just cannot get my head around what is going on with this, the benefit, the tax on the benefit system, and the tax on PIP. I've been on job seekers allowance. I've been on universal credit. I've helped people fill in PIP applications. They're extremely time consuming. It's an extremely invasive, difficult process. It's dehumanizing. It's really difficult. It's really, really difficult to get PIP. And obviously where do people have, people are on PIP in places like South Wales, where you've got high levels of former industrial injury, northeast of England. Labour's core heartlands, by the way, and this is a massive attack on their own base. It really is absolutely incredible what's going on. And if you look at the economy, as you've discussed many times on your wonderful show, the UK economy is tanking because production is falling off a cliff because of rentierism. All the benefits are going to people. Loads of benefits are going to people in work because work doesn't pay, rather than focusing on building the economy and growing it in a way that's sustainable and providing meaningful work for people. They decided just attack people who were unfortunate enough to be on the benefit system. And I don't know, I'm just getting so angry thinking about it. It really is mind-blowing stuff.
You mentioned JSA. I mean, it's really important to say this job seekers allowance for people who aren't familiar with the benefit system in this country. JSA for anybody under 25 years old in this country is £71.70 a week. Nobody seriously thinks you can live on that, by the way. It's effectively like the poor laws in the 19th century. It's about incentivizing you to take any job. The point is to not take it. It's £90 if you're above 25. So the idea that the benefit system in this country is generous is outlandish. It's outlandish. It's stupid. And by the way, some people say, well, good, I don't want people to take benefits. Fine, think that. But somehow the people that say that will also say at the same time it's really generous. Okay. The government is hoping to save billions of pounds with benefit cuts, but Labour MP Zara Sultana, who's currently sitting in Parliament without the Labour whip, called her party out for not adopting a progressive alternative.
Pollution Foundation has warned that cuts to PIP could see 620,000 people lose around £675 a month, hitting the poorest families hardest. With 870,000 children living in PIP-receiving households, 290,000 of whom are already living below the poverty line, how can the government justify pushing more disabled people and children into poverty instead of pursuing fairer alternatives such as a 2% wealth tax on assets over 10 million? This would raise 24 billion, 5 times as much as those proposed from these cuts. Is austerity 2.0 the change people really voted for?
Disability charity Scope slammed Labour's cuts for being, quote, devastating and catastrophic for disabled people on X. Scope said these plans should shame the government to its core. Elsewhere, independent MP and former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn also took to social media, posting this. This is a seminal moment, a Labour government cutting disability benefits. Not just continuing Tory levels, cutting. This comes after a week of speculation, itself an act of cruelty, by a government toying with people's dignity. These cuts are disgraceful and will cost lives. Dan, you've written about the petty bourgeois as a voting bloc. That's the theme running right through your book. These kinds of reforms are intended to appeal to precisely those kinds of voters, you know, small businesses, tradesmen, etc. The kinds of people that are perceived as a Labour, Tory floating voter, may be reform curious. Intuitively, do you think that this kind of headline is going to play well with the kinds of voters you talk about so lucidly in your book?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Obviously, Thatcher, decimated the welfare state by focusing on this narrative of the scrounger, and what that really does is it poisons the well. You can't really have a sustainable welfare state. The welfare state, what is it based on? It's based on this shared identity, shared idea of suffering in the Second World War, this idea that everyone's paying in, and therefore if you suffer hard times or industrial injury, then you've paid your national insurance contributions and you can get relief. And obviously once you start this narrative of scroungers, or this idea that there are free riders and people are not putting in and they're sort of taken from everyone else, then that really starts the destruction of the welfare state ideologically, because people don't want to start paying in anymore if they think that other people are getting something for nothing. But obviously the difference is that Thatcher wanted to get rid of the welfare state. She wanted to absolutely destroy it. Whereas the Labour Party are meant to be, they want to keep it going. But focusing on this, I should say as well, the idea of the scrounger has sort of permeated so deeply into the British psyche that you have empirical ethnographic studies of welfare benefits claimants, and they're all saying, yeah, I'm on welfare, but other people shouldn't get it because they're scroungers. So right down to people who are actually receiving welfare, this narrative of the scrounger has sort of permeated the common sense of the UK, and really it's been massively destructive ideologically for the idea of for the idea of the welfare state and for social cohesion and social trust in the UK in general. Because if everyone thinks everyone else is getting something for nothing, then it has a massively destructive effect on how we sort of interact with each other. But it is interesting. Are Labour going after this section of the hard-working majority of the lower middle classes that, generally speaking, do go for this narrative. They do tend to think that we're the hardworking backbone of society and people shouldn't be getting something for nothing. They tended to look down on people immediately below them, i.e. the working class as sort of as skivers compared to sort of the petty bourgeoisie. And obviously, as I've said in the book and the interview, it's generally this low middle class cohort which drove Thatcherism. They're now driving reform. So whether Labour are, it does seem that they are trying to peel off this block by going for this this narrative of the scrounger. But it's really difficult to tell, because I don't think at this stage the petty bourgeoisie are going to come over or into Labour, because a key part of the Thatcherite narrative and a key part of the ideology of the low middle classes is basically a hatred of the welfare state and a hatred of the state bureaucracy in general. So I don't think that anything Labour do is going to sort of peel them off, because this stuff is believable when it comes from Thatcher. It came from Thatcher, or even believable when it comes from Farage. But when it comes from people who basically personify the state bureaucracy, someone like Starmer, I don't think people are going to really see stuff like this and think, oh, well, that's great, now I'm voting for Labour. So all this is really doing, I think, politically, is going to cause a massive political crisis within the Labour Party and possibly a backbench rebellion, if any of them have any backbone. But it's just going to further decimate Labour's own base. And it seems like they're just, I don't know, it's almost acting like a case study in how to facilitate the rise of right-wing populism, because they're going to destroy their own social base in places like South Wales, I think.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think something like, for instance, reducing foreign aid, a reform-curious voter might look at that and say, yeah, I agree. I appreciate not many people watching this or listening to this will agree, but I think that's quite clear. But when a Labour PM says we're going to introduce a new means test and reduce this and tweak this and do that, people zone out. The idea it's going to be some sort of election win, I don't think is right. By the way, I don't think that's the intention. They're doing this because there is no money, because they've completely screwed up with growth, right? There was never a plan if there was no growth. The plan was growth. There is no growth. So they're now having to look down the back of the settee, and their default response is, of course, people with disabilities, benefit system, etc. That's what they do. And at the same time, you've got this massive increase in defense spending ahead of 2030. The US military wants to build a space radar park in a Welsh national park. No, that's not a joke. According to the UK government, the Deep Space Advanced Radar Capability, or DARC, very catchy, would be deployed by the US military to, quote, detect, identify, and track objects in Earth's orbit, including satellites, space debris, and asteroids. The development would put 27 radar dishes overlooking the UK's only coastal national park. Here's the official line about why the installation needs to be built.
The UK National Space Operations Centre protects space and Earth 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Our combined civilian and military operations teams track objects that might impact Earth, prevent satellite collisions, monitor hostile threats, enable missions and more to ensure space remains safe, secure and sustainable, now and for future generations.
Making safe and sustainable space. How do you make space sustainable? I mean, it's pretty sustainable. The planet's 5 billion years old. Pretty sustainable. I'm pretty sure it'll sustain long after we're gone. The dark dishes would certainly be conspicuous. They measure 20 meters high and 15 meters wide. The program is part of the trilateral AUKUS security partnership with the United States and Australia, both the governments of those countries, with both the US and Australia also hosting similar sites to DARC in response to possible threats from bad countries. You know where I'm talking about: Russia, China, Iran, though I don't know quite what Iran is going to do. In any case, when this was announced in December 2023, then Defence Secretary Grant Shapps said tracking activity in, quote, deep space would help the UK protect itself from space warfare. The MOD has said radars would enable nations to identify objects up to 22,000 miles from Earth. The science is certainly inspiring. The applications less so. The good people of Pembrokeshire aren't having it, though, because more than 17,000 people have signed a petition opposing the development. No radar, they say. This is not your typical NIMBYism about pylons ruining your view or trains obstructing a bat getting home before anyone gets angry. I love bats. Maybe not £100 million worth of love, but I do love bats. But these are really high stakes, joking aside. After all, campaigners are concerned about their security. The development would put local residents in the unenviable position of living next door to a potential military target, the front line of United States space defense. Russia has 5,000 nuclear-tipped missiles. And of course, nobody sensible wants to be a candidate for one of those. There are already certain targets you can imagine: Faslane, Aldershot, Westminster, Portsmouth, maybe Camberley, maybe Hereford. Now add Pembrokeshire to the list. Besides that, campaigners are concerned about dangerous levels of radiation from the system, despite the MOD claiming that it is not hazardous to health. Why take the risk, I guess? Today, an early day motion calling to scrap the development is being tabled in Westminster by Plaid Cymru MP Liz Saville Roberts. Dan, as a Welshman, what do you think of rural Wales being on the front line of a space war between the US and China?
Well, actually, Aaron, there's a long history of this, Welsh land being used for the British military-industrial complex. 1940, Epynt, which is a community in Powys, basically got forcibly cleared for a military site. The residents are never allowed to go back. Today, huge amounts of land in Wales are given over to British military training areas. You've got obviously the Brecon Beacons, which is used for special forces selection. You've got Castle Martin Ranges in Pembrokeshire, which sort of overlooks the beautiful Pembrokeshire coastline. You've got RAF Valley in Anglesey. This is one of Wales's functions. In the British economic system, it functions as a place, just as a space, a military, basically a large military training area where you can do adventure training for the troops. And obviously the Welsh government have obviously bought into this Faustian pact with successive British governments, whether they're Tory or Labour. Welsh government representatives are always at international arms fairs, sort of selling Wales as a place to come and do business, invest. I mean, it's not just space. Obviously there's armaments that are produced all across Wales and South Wales valleys. So it's really part of a long and terrible tradition of sort of using Wales's topography for the British military, and obviously it leaves it. And there's drones obviously in West Wales as well. So obviously I'm opposed to it. The residents are right to reject it. It makes as a target, dangerous radiation. Well, they should put it in London.
That's it. Put on to number 10 Downing Street. No, of course they won't. Of course they won't. They'll give some pseudo-scientific reason. They could put it in the Surrey Hills or something, right? Presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's obviously a very strong pacifist tradition in Wales. I don't think it's particularly well known in the British mainstream, but a long history of sort of anti-militarism related to the Welsh nonconformist tradition. Huge amounts of non-violent activism, sort of protesting against these sites within Plaid Cymru, within Cymdeithas y Cymoedd, the peace movement. Very big tradition of sort of resisting militarism in Wales, and and this stuff has really insidious effects. I mean, my own research into sort of military recruitment in sort of schools and places in South Wales sort of shows really that the more militarized an area is in terms of troop buildups, in terms of military factories, basically leads to the normalization of sort of military careers and young Welsh people who now have no work in places like Batol, but are obviously probably going to be funneled into the British war machine. So it's all it's quite depressing stuff on today's show, actually.
I first met Gary Stevenson 3 years ago in 2022. At the time, he was a former Citibank trader who was passionate about asset and income inequality. He said things I agreed with, but in a new kind of way, insisting that without massive change, working people would only get poorer forever. All of that informed the first interview I did with him that year. It got more than 1 million views, even though we did it before he'd even finished writing his book, let alone published it. Its title? The Plan is to Make You Permanently Poorer. Stevenson published his first book, The Trading Game, A Confession, with Penguin in hardback in May 2024. At that point, his YouTube channel had around 200,000 subscribers. Fast forward to today, less than a year later, and the paperback edition is out. What's more, it's been top of the Sunday Times bestseller list for 6 weeks straight. Been on the tube lately? If you have, then I'm guessing you've probably seen Gary Stevenson basically everywhere. Then there's the fact his YouTube channel has now passed 1 million subscribers. It's gone from 250,000 to 1 million in under a year. But the really crazy thing is that subscriber rate is accelerating. He's added over 300,000 subscribers in the last month alone. In other words, he's adding at least 10,000 subscribers every day. Some days it's 20,000. Meanwhile, on his Instagram account, Stevenson's added 190,000 followers in the last month. So he's a big deal in print media. He's big on his own YouTube channel and big on his own social platforms. He's also pretty big elsewhere too, it has to be said. Here's a short selection of Stevenson's greatest hits over the past few months.
We've watched the biggest ever increase in millionaire and billionaire wealth in the history of this planet, immediately followed by a collapse in living standards of the middle class, a complete collapse in the ability of ordinary people to own assets, and nobody's drawing the connection. And unless the general public, your average British man or woman on the street, understands we need to deal with inequality to protect our living standards, to protect our homes, to protect our children, it'll be impossible. The reason those predictions were good is because it's the same reason I've got a track record of making correct economic predictions for 15 years. Because I'm f***ing good at this. If you don't make money, it's because you didn't hustle hard enough. You need to work harder. We send that message to young men in a society which makes it increasingly, extremely difficult, bordering on impossible to make money.
I've no idea how many languages Gary's book is being translated into right now. But speaking personally, in just the last week, I've had publishers from Poland, Germany, and Sweden get in touch to talk to him. They say, how do I get in contact with Gary Stevenson? This is a major vibe shift. It's a moment where a guy talking about asset inequality is in W.H. Smith's at Waterloo. He's in the 3 for 2 section at airports and service stations. That is not normal. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've never seen it before. Dan, it's a weird thing to say, but these numbers, for me anyway, are reminiscent of Andrew Tate right at the start. Now, I'm not suggesting Gary Stevenson is a left-wing Andrew Tate. I'm not saying that for one moment. I don't think we want that, for starters. But somebody who's gaining 300,000 YouTube subscribers in 1 month, who's a bestseller for 6 weeks, top of the charts. You can find them on the bookshelves in Tesco. This says something quite significant about the moment we're in, doesn't it?
Oh, I massively agree. And Gary's a great bloke. I'm so happy he's having all this, that he's getting all this amazing coverage. And I mean, I've used him a lot in my university courses, sort of helping to sort of demystify economics. It's just absolutely fantastic that you've got a normal, working class guy who's able to sort of very coherently and succinctly explain complicated economic problems and explain to people why things are going wrong and why living standards are tanking. And he's talking about, wealth inequality. I think, there's a massive, massive appetite for this stuff. Obviously there's a political void where, there should be a new left movement sort of filling it. And I think the fact that people are going for Gary's work is evidence that people are sort of people are desperate for change, and they're desperate for progressive, what I would say, socialist answers, and Gary's providing them. So long may it continue.
Yeah, I've had a few conversations with right-wingers about Gary Stevenson, and I think they're coping really hard. They'll say, well, Joseph Stiglitz sells books as well. Naomi Klein sells books. They sell books. This is different. This is a cultural figure. And I would think of somebody like, and I'm not saying Gary's at that level yet, Jordan Peterson, right? Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate. Now, bear with me a moment. I'm not insulting Gary. What those people do is they offer a very distinctive, clear, easy to understand story about why things are going wrong in your life. Very simple. Gary does the same thing. Why are you in your overdraft? Why can't you get on the housing ladder? Why is your local community looking worse every year? Why is your high street dying? And I think in that respect, Gary is, a similar cultural figure to some of the people I've just mentioned. And like I say, that's new. Not happened before. And I think it's a massive, massive development worth celebrating. US President Donald Trump is no stranger to keeping controversial company. And this week he invited Irish MMA fighter Conor McGregor to the White House for St. Patrick's Day.
Happy Paddy's Day, America!
In 2024, McGregor was found liable for sexual assault in a civil trial after a woman accused him of brutally raping and battering her in a hotel room. The court ordered him to pay over £200,000 in damages, approximately €250,000. McGregor has been described by Trump as one of his, quote, favourite Irish people. And the official White House X account posted a grid of photos showing McGregor enjoying his time with the president. In a Q&A session with reporters, McGregor made these following comments.
Our government has long since abandoned the voices of the people of Ireland. And it's high time that America is made aware of what is going on in Ireland. What is going on in Ireland is a travesty. Our government is the government of zero action with zero accountability. You know, our money is being spent on overseas issues that has nothing to do with the Irish people. The illegal immigration racket is running ravage on the country. There are rural towns in Ireland that have been overrun in one swoop, that have become a minority in one swoop.
His anti-immigration remarks were denounced by Ireland's Taoiseach, Michael Martin, who said, quote, Conor McGregor's remarks are wrong and do not reflect the spirit of St. Patrick's Day or the views of the people of Ireland. An Irish journalist also criticised McGregor's presence at the White House and a warning that this contains a very graphic account from a forensic examiner. So this is from the journalist Barry Malone. What a disgrace. Conor McGregor is roundly despised in Ireland. Only the most hateful of racists have any time for him. Here is what a gynecologist told the court when he lost a civil rape case last year. Now, this is the graphic description, quite extraordinary. Dr. Daniel Kane, a gynecologist and forensic examiner, told the court how he had to use forceps to remove a tampon Ms. Hand said she had been wearing on the night of the assault, which had been, quote, wedged inside. A paramedic who examined Ms. Hand on the day after the alleged attacks said she had not seen a patient as bruised as Ms. Hand was in a long time. Quite extraordinary. And this person is now effectively a representative of the people of Ireland at the White House on St. Patrick's Day. Another ex-user commented on the perceived similarities between Trump and McGregor. Nothing quite sums up America right now like a rapist, Conor McGregor, their words, bowling out of the White House in a suit that doesn't fit after meeting a man, Trump, who paid off a porn star, is an adjudicated SA offender, sexual assault, and has a wardrobe of badly fitting suits. Dan, what do you make of this meeting of minds at the White House? Strange choice for St. Patrick's Day. I mean, this is really important because, of course, in American political culture, the Irish community is enormous. You know, they really are enormous. And it seems odd to polarize Irish Americans across these lines where you have somebody in the White House denigrating the mother country.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually followed Conor McGregor's career from when he was fighting all the way back in Cage Warriors. And it's a sort of case study in how fame and fortune sort of destroys someone. And it's been quite, I mean, obviously he's done a lot of, allegedly bad things, but it's been quite sad to see the decline of a really promising athlete. He's also a walking anti-cocaine advert. It's really, really, he's obviously struggling with drink and drugs, I think. And McGregor's always, I mean, he at the height of his fame, he was turning up to St. Patrick's Day parades in places like Savannah, Georgia. He was given bottles of Proper 12 whiskey to the fire departments. He was almost, he's a huge, enormous celebrity by, far and away the biggest UFC fighter of all time, I'd say, or certainly the most prominent, the guy who's sort of been a huge cash cow for the sport, but has now deteriorated, into an incredibly divisive, almost tragic figure, and his head's getting a lot bigger as well. I've been through that sort of process myself with alcohol, but it's sad what's happened. It is divisive, but obviously it's all part of the sort of this crazy sort of amalgamation that the Trump presidency has ushered in between politics, wrestling, MMA, or kayfabe, all this sort of. Well, and it just makes you feel like you're going a bit mad that all these figures are now in and out of the White House, becoming political commentators. It's all very, very jarring and strange.
Yeah, I mean, as recently as 2021, I think Conor McGregor was the best paid athlete in the world. Not because of earnings, but because of endorsements. Astronomical figures involved. Certainly the highest paid athlete in Europe, other than Cristiano Ronaldo. I think in 2021, he was even higher than Ronaldo. So you're talking about somebody with tremendous star quality at their height, earning huge amounts of money. And like you say, Dan, they've just kind of become this advert to not drink and please don't take Class A drugs. Of course, we don't know if he's taking Class A drugs in those videos, not least. He certainly does like a drink. Nothing wrong with that. But substance abuse can go hand in hand with rather obnoxious, illegal, abusive behaviours in the case of McGregor. We've already covered a few of those. I'm sure there's many more besides. Dan, it's been really nice talking to you tonight. I want to get you back on soon, but we'll have to make sure there are there's no upset at home. The family comes first, Dan.
Well, I'll bring him on next time if you want. I'm sure he'd be happy to come on. But no, I'm really grateful for having me on, mate. Thanks so much again.
It was a real pleasure, and I really want to get you back on for a Downstream soon, Dan. I'm saying this here to put you on the spot. Everybody I talk to who's watched that conversation we had on Downstream about your book is very complimentary. Great book, really worth reading. Nation of Shopkeepers. Where else can people find you, by the way, on social media?
Oh, I'm on Twitter. Still, I don't know why I'm on there. At die_electic. It's a bit complicated, but I haven't been on Instagram, I think, for 7 months. But I need to probably go back on to do a bulking update for my son, to put some photos of him up. But yeah, I've been trying to sort of stay off social media because with the baby and everything. But it is difficult. I mean, Twitter's just a cesspit, but I check it every day anyway.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in tonight. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.